Michael is a teenager who finds it hard to control his anger. He was the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. He gets angry even at the slightest things. One day, Michael was in the classroom and one of his classmates, David, accidentally stepped on his toes. Michael became furious that he beat the boy until blood started running from the boy's mouth and face. His teacher separated them and took them to his office where he called their parents. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were so angry at their son Michael that they cried and asked God to help their son. They took him to church for prayer sessions, but it wasn't helping. One evening, Mrs. Smith thought of something. She thought that if they prayed together for their son, that God will heal him. After their prayer that night, Michael had a dream. In that dream, an angel appeared to him and placed his hand on his heart. "Let it go," the angel told Michael. "Why should I let it go?" Michael asked immediately. "Because our Father in heaven has forgiven you your sins, so you should also forgive others," the angel said before disappearing. "No!" Michael screamed as he sprung up from his bed in horror. Sweat gushed down his body. Mr. and Mrs. Smith ran into his room after hearing his scream. "What is it, son?" they both chorused. He couldn't utter a word because of fear. He was shaking, his hands and legs trembling. His lips were vibrating from fear. Mrs. Smith pulled him in for an embrace. "It's fine, son. Everything is going to be fine," Mrs. Smith assured Michael. Throughout that day, Michael didn't come out of his room. His best friend, Victor, came looking for him that afternoon. "Michael, good afternoon, Miss Smith," Victor greeted her. "Good afternoon, Victor," she replied while making cereal. "Is Michael in his room?" Victor asked Mrs. Smith. "He is, but he doesn't want to come out. He's been there since morning. He hasn't even eaten. I think he might listen to you," Mrs. Smith told Victor sadly. Victor nodded before going into the room. He met Michael laying on his bed with his eyes open. "What is it, Michael? Your mom told me you haven't come out of your room since morning, and you haven't eaten." Victor started softly. Victor was the only person Michael listened to because they go way back. Victor was always there to calm Michael down when he was angry, ever since their childhood. Michael couldn't utter a word because of how shocked he was from that dream. After Victor tried talking to him for a while, he left. After that day, Mr. and Mrs. Smith noticed that Michael became calm. He did things without getting angry. One morning, after Mr. Smith had gone to work, Mrs. Smith decided to ask him about the sudden change. "Why did you become so calm, son? After that night you woke up, everything changed about you." Mrs. Smith asked him with concern. "I had a dream. An angel appeared to me and told me to let go, and after I woke up, I couldn't contain the kind of fire I felt, so I screamed. I noticed my body also changed. I didn't have the strength to get angry anymore. My heart felt melted," Michael said, weeping. "It's fine, son. I'm happy for you," Mrs. Smith said as she pulled him in for an embrace. Mrs. Smith couldn't give birth to another child after 16 years. She conceived again. It felt like things started changing for good around the house. Everything felt different. One day at school, Michael walked the boy he beat up at school, David. The boy looked at him with fear. "What do you want?" the boy stuttered as he moved away from Michael. "I'm not here to hurt you or curse you. I just came to apologize for what happened. I'm so sorry. I've realized my mistakes and I'm trying to make amends on them," Michael apologized. The boy was surprised because it felt surreal. He smiled and embraced Michael warmly. "God has instructed us to forgive one another, so I forgive you," he said, smiling. Everyone in the school heard and noticed Michael's new character and were happy for him. A few years later, Michael graduated from high school and went into college where he studied medicine. He became closer to God and more intentional with Him.